So this next section, we're going to look at different orientation of pelvis, and then we're going to go into more detail with the cushions. So that's kind of going to help link in with what we talked about this morning with regards to the importance of stability and some of the guidelines from NHS and EPUAP. So the pelvis can move in obliquity. We've got that movement. We've got posterior, anterior tilt, and we've got rotation. So there's the three areas of movement that we're going to find the pelvic that we need to try and maintain and support. The most common one, like we kind of talked about this morning, was the tendency to go into a posterior tilt. And a little reason behind that is that as we close the hip angle up, it naturally wants to push the pelvis back. So in order to kind of stop that from happening, we need to have a little bit of support posteriorly behind the pelvis. Alongside that, we also have a motion of the hips, which I'm looking at there, but you can see up there behind it. And we have abduction, adduction. So abduction is moving out, adduction towards the centre. We've got flexion and extension of the hips. So flexion, extension, we extend out. Internal and external rotation of the thigh. So we can see that happening when we bring the foot plate up. So body scooching back a little bit in the seat. So there we get in the femurs nicely driven through the femoral channels in the cushion, and then as we raise up, we go into external rotation of the hips. I know this cushion is a little bit too small anyway, but this gives a nice example of that's what the external rotation is, and particularly that can be a consequence of when the feet are too close together on a centre-mount foot plate. So, is everyone happy with those positions? Yeah? Would you at any point assess somebody on a plinth in your day-to-day work? Yeah? No?
Usually with an outage.
I would, if someone is becoming a little bit more asymmetric, that's kind of the point of where that's always a baseline measure, is to do a plinth assessment. So by doing that, you can then ascertain whether the pelvis is in any of these kind of more fixed components. If you're sitting on a flat surface, you can then gauge what level of obliquity the person has, posterior, anterior tilt, because the flat surface will just mean that if you it will kind of give the game away as to how the pelvis is actually sitting, if you will. So if it does drop down to one side, you'll get a gauge of that on the flat surface. It won't be masked by cushioning underneath it. That way you can then start to identify how much build-up you need, the way you may need it. Okay. So here we go, we have pelvis up there. For pelvic stability, we need posterior, anterior and lateral support in a seated position because the pelvis is a 3D structure. You can see the difference on the bottom picture here between pelvis when we're standing upright to a pelvis that's sitting. So you can see that little bit of posterior tilt as we close that hip angle down. It presents more onto the sacrum. And these green lines are showing where we need to get that additional support. The bottom green line is actually in the wrong place. It needs to be the trochanter. So I will do that now. But that's where we get, if we have a force acting on the back of the pelvis here, we need an alternate force acting on the pelvis anteriorly to create that stability. Because laterally, it's great if we just support under the trochanters, because that's kind of taken out that need, or it's enabled that level of stability. But then likewise, if we add a force here, we need to balance it out with an additional force anteriorly. So that's kind of what we were chatting through at the lunch break. That will just help us give more stability through the pelvis in a seated position. So we can do that by using a contour cushion. And we've got one on the desk here. So we've got the domino cushion, which is more of a severe kind of contour cushion, but it's giving that quite distinct posterior prompt and then the anterior prompt for the pelvis to sit in. And then you've got the lateral capability of that pelvic well. So there's a lot of talk around pelvic wells, but then you've got the different diameters and different distances there on lots of different types of cushions. So that will give us, we can see here, if we get that set up right, we can then stabilize the pelvis. So we have the ischial ramp, you can see. So we've got the ischial ramp blocking up front, and we can move these posterior prompts in to really guide the pelvis and give additional support. That will then make sure that we're getting a lumbar curve in the best possible position. So the problem we have with the lumbar curve is you've got the biggest vertebrae in your spine and you've got the most amount of flexion to extension. So if this isn't stabilized properly and it's allowed to kind of go into a posterior tilt, you're going to get the most amount of movement and your lumbar spine will just conform to whatever shape it's pushing up against. So if we start with a cushion without these prompts, and the person cannot maintain their seated stability themselves, you're going to start to rock back. And if your backrest is flat, then the lumbar spine is going to push into it. So over the period of the day, or however long someone's going to be sitting in the seat, you're going to flatten your lumbar curve, and that's where we can get people complaining of lower back pain because the joints, the vertebrae, is not in the position that they want them to be in. And again, that's why it's so important that we do have that pelvic stability. But that's just a nice little example of what happens if we don't have that posterior prompt. It's great having the little ischial ramp, but if the pelvis is still shifting back, the IT is going to sit up against the ischial ramp, but that's where the forces are kind of going. So the little example here on the right-hand side is blocking the back of the pelvis. But by blocking the back of the pelvis, again, you need that anterior support. And then you need to allow for that spinal extension, for that natural curvature. So that's great if you're just using a seat base and a backrest, but then to be able to potentially tilt it back by 5 degrees, that will make it more energy efficient for the person who's sitting in it because you're not disrupting their field of vision, but you're allowing them to kind of sink into it and to sit into the backrest a little bit more. So just utilising that. I mean, you can, if the tilt is an expensive option and you don't actually necessarily need it for anything else, you could always put an additional wedge that the cushion comes with underneath to prompt the person to go back into the seat. So these are all Care seat bases. Now, I think there's about 8 different seat bases, but over the course of the 12, 14 years I've worked with it, these are the 4 that kind of keep cropping up. Annoyingly, because they're all Italian, they all end in O, which is not good for a Yorkshireman with his accent. So we've got the Mediano, I'll get out of the way now. Dato, Novo, Domino. Yorkshire Italian, I don't think seems to mix very well. But so the Mediano is, as you can kind of guess, medium contouring, but you can still do quite a lot with it. So the rationale behind the design of this is more around active transfers, side transfers, because if you've got something like this, for someone to do a side transfer, you've got to go over the top and into it. Whereas if you've still got a level of asymmetry that you want to manage, you can still do it really nicely with the Mediano cushion. I tend to use this when you've got people with a little bit of obliquity. The beauty of having quite a structured conformed cushion is that it gives the person the sense of where they need to be on the seat. So the standard visco stuff that we have, they're great for people with that kind of, with good upper body stability. But if you just need that landing spot, a specific landing spot, this is a really nice start. So if you do have a little bit of pelvic obliquity, it can be managed really nicely within this cushion. We can also, it comes with all these different additional parts as well, so we can build up the front, increase the femoral channels, we can increase the trochanter support, You do have smaller posterior prompts here, but that's where you need the backrest to kind of come in and fill some of that in. But you do have a little ischial ramp. So again, the person who's using this type of cushion has more sitting stability. They have more ability to kind of transfer and have that active transfer. We'll get hands on after I just go through it. The next one is the tailor. So it's a little bit of a hybrid almost between a mediano and a domino. This has been designed specifically for people with a high spinal break. So you've got that real nice postural posterior control. We can sit in these and try them and see what you think. The material down the side of these, the density of this foam is a little bit softer to aid that side transfer. So we're looking for people who are doing active transfers but need that high level of postural support. By having something like this, it's starting the pelvis off with a lovely amount of stability, which is then easy to control the rest of the spine. If you need to accommodate lower leg length, femoral leg length discrepancy, we can adjust it accordingly, and kind of play around with the pelvic well to do obliquity and rotation. This one has been designed specifically for spinal injury users. So there's a couple of little kind of things on here for the design is. So you've got the little cutout there for the trochanter. So if you've got someone who's atrophied quite heavily, you've got the little trochanter cut out. You've got an additional pad for ischial support. They've used particular materials on here to reduce the amount of vibrations going through the spine. So they've got kind of a couple of different densities of foam, and then you've got the other foam that goes on top of it. This is all a little bit softer. So again, from a transfer perspective, it's easy to get in, but it allows for that contouring, and it's slightly chamfered at the front as well. So when you put it into an active chair, you've already got that little bit of a cutout at the front. So this is relatively new, maybe about 5 years, I think, 6 years. But again, it gives us a little bit of a balance between the mediano might have been a bit too much to get into it for an active user, but because the components are a little bit softer. We also have additional parts at the back, so we can kind of build up and create a little bit of additional anterior support, posterior support. You've got loads of stuff with that. So it's like in a spinal injury kind of domino version, if you will. But these 4 cushions kind of give us a real nice variation for assessment.